The axes fell in rhythm. 27 strikes before the screaming stopped. What drives men to hunt their own kind into the mountains? And what happens when the hunted become the hunters? The Ozarks in 1898 were not the picturesque backdrop of modern tourism brochures. They were a labyrinth of limestone ridges and sunken hollows, where the air hung thick with moisture and rot, where footsteps on forest floor released the smell of clay and decaying leaves, where tree bark felt slick under your palm even in summer. In these hills, a clan had lived for 3 generations, so isolated that neighboring counties spoke of them only in whispers at Sunday services. The Dunleavy family, 11 adults, countless children, none of whom had ever registered a birth or paid a tax. Their compound sat in a valley locals called Blackwater Hollow, accessible only by a single deer path that wound through stands of white oak and hickory. No surveyor had mapped it. No census taker had returned from attempting to count them. By late summer of that year, livestock had begun disappearing from farms along the border of Newton County. First a hog here, a milk cow there, then entire herds. Farmers found hoof prints leading into the forest, but never out. One rancher, Thomas Whelan, followed tracks to the edge of Blackwater Hollow on August 9th. His horse returned alone 3 days later, blood crusted on the saddle. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Before we go deeper into the hollow, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? If this story hooks you, hit that like button and subscribe. You'll want to be here for what comes next. On September 2nd, 1898, a town meeting convened in the Methodist Church of Cassville, Missouri. 47 men attended. The county sheriff, Jacob Marston, stood at the pulpit and read a prepared statement. The Dunleavy clan was to be approached, questioned, and if evidence warranted, arrested for theft and suspected murder. He called for volunteers to form a citizen militia. 34 men raised their hands. Most were farmers. A few were veterans of the Civil War, gray-bearded and lean, who still kept their service revolvers oiled. They assembled at dawn on September 5th at the base of Iron Mountain, with provisions for 3 days. Marston led them. A local trapper named Cyrus Webb, who claimed to know a second route into Blackwater Hollow, served as guide. The militia entered the forest at 6:47 a.m. They never came back. For the first 2 days, townspeople assumed the search was simply taking longer than expected. The terrain was punishing. Webb himself had warned that ravines could swallow a man whole if he stepped wrong in the fog. But by September 8th, when no word had arrived, unease curdled into dread. A second group of 12 men ventured to the forest edge, calling out, firing rifles into the air as signals. Silence answered. On September 10th, a boy hunting squirrels near Crane Creek found a hat. It belonged to Daniel Foster, one of the militiamen. Inside the brim, his wife had stitched his initials in red thread. The hat was soaked through, heavy with something darker than rainwater. The boy ran home and did not speak for 3 days. What the authorities did next reveals how deeply the fear had set in. Instead of sending a larger force, the governor's office in Jefferson City issued a terse statement on September 14th. The militia had likely succumbed to a rock slide or flash flood, common tragedies in the Ozark backcountry. No further search would be authorized. Families were told to mourn and move on. The official record lists the 34 men as missing, presumed dead by natural causes. But the people of Newton County knew better. Survivors from nearby homesteads, those who lived close enough to hear but far enough to survive, began speaking in hushed tones about what they'd witnessed on the night of September 6th. screams that echoed off the bluffs until dawn, the smell of wood smoke so thick it turned the moon red, and a sound one woman described as a hymn, but wrong, like voices singing backward. The clan had not been flushed out. They had been waiting. In the weeks following the disappearance, 3 more families along the hollow's perimeter abandoned their homesteads, leaving behind furniture, livestock, and land deeds. One farmer left a note nailed to his front door. "Gone to Kentucky. Do not follow." Another simply vanished, his cabin door left swinging open, a pot of beans still warm on the stove. Then, as October frost settled over the ridges, something else began to surface. Pieces. A tobacco pouch wedged between river stones. A boot, still laced, found hanging from a low branch. A belt buckle stamped with initials. E.H., belonging to Elias Harmon, a militiaman and father of 5. Each item appeared in a different location, miles apart, as if deliberately scattered across the forest like breadcrumbs in a nightmare. No bodies were ever recovered. The Ozarks swallowed 34 men whole, and the government sealed the file before questions could multiply. But sealing a file does not silence a mountain. What really happened in Blackwater Hollow? And why did those in power work so hard to bury it? The answer lies not in what the militia found when they entered the hollow, but in what the hollow had been hiding for decades before they arrived. The first Dunleavy arrived in the Ozarks with blood already on his hands. Understanding the massacre requires understanding the family that orchestrated it and the dark inheritance they carried into those hills. Ezekiel Dunleavy stepped off a riverboat in Springfield, Missouri, in 1853, carrying a single trunk and a letter of introduction that was never presented. Records from Kentucky, where he claimed to originate, list no family by that name in the counties he mentioned. His wife, Constance, rarely spoke and never smiled. Their 3 sons, all under age 10, watched strangers with the fixed stare of feral dogs. Within a year, the family had vanished into the uncharted hollows west of Cassville. They were not the first to seek refuge in the Ozarks. The region had long served as a sanctuary for those fleeing debts, warrants, or pasts too dark to drag into daylight. But the Dunleavys were different. They did not simply hide. They built. By 1860, trappers reported seeing structures deep in Blackwater Hollow. A main lodge constructed from whole logs, outbuildings with sod roofs, and something else that made even hardened frontiersmen uneasy. A perimeter of sharpened stakes, 10 feet tall, ringing the entire compound. The stakes faced outward. Local Osage guides refused to enter the area. One elder, interviewed by a circuit preacher in 1864, called Blackwater Hollow a place where the earth had turned its back on the sky. He claimed his grandfather had warned against settling there generations before white men arrived, that the valley held a hunger that predates names. Whether cursed or simply strategic, the location offered the Dunleavys complete isolation. The hollow sat in a geographical anomaly, a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by ridges too steep for horses and too dense with undergrowth for wagons. The single deer path that Webb would later use twisted through rock formations that could easily be defended or collapsed. Water came from an underground spring that never froze. Game was plentiful. A family could live there for decades without needing the outside world. And the Dunleavys did. They became ghosts long before the massacre. By 1870, the original 3 sons had grown, married women whose origins no one could trace, and produced children of their own. Census records from that decade list no Dunleavys. Tax rolls show no property under that name. Yet farmers along the border occasionally traded with them. Salt for venison, fabric for furs, and those interactions followed a rigid pattern. The Dunleavys would emerge at dusk, complete the exchange without conversation, and vanish before full dark. Their money was always pre-Civil War coinage, as if they'd been hoarding it since the war itself. One merchant in Cassville kept a ledger. Between 1872 and 1889, he recorded 19 separate transactions with the Hollow people. His notes described them as clean but strange, polite but cold, and the children never blink enough. What were they doing in those years of silence? A traveling physician named Howard Lusk may have glimpsed the answer. In 1883, he treated a young woman in Aurora who'd been badly injured in what she described as a fall from a wagon. Her wounds told a different story. Defensive cuts on her palms, bruising around her wrists consistent with restraints. She was 8 months pregnant. When Lusk asked where she lived, she gave no answer, only stared at the window until he left the room. By morning, she was gone. Lusk later wrote in his journal, "She moved like someone who'd forgotten how people walk, as if she'd learned it from watching rather than doing." The woman's description matched the Dunleavy daughters-in-law perfectly, but it was the children who drew the most attention, or rather, the lack thereof. In nearly 40 years, no Dunleavy child was ever seen in Cassville or any nearby town. Not at the general store, not at church socials, not even at the autumn harvest fairs that drew families from 50 miles around. Estimates placed the clan's size at anywhere from 15 to 30 individuals by the 1890s, yet they remained utterly invisible except for those brief, ritualized trading visits. What kind of life were those children living? In 1896, 2 years before the massacre, a fire broke out in the southern Ozarks that burned for 11 days. When it finally died, a hunter named Samuel Greer ventured into the charred landscape looking for game forced out by the flames. He found something else. A cache of tools hidden in a limestone cave 3 miles from Blackwater Hollow. 27 axes, their handles worn smooth from use. 14 skinning knives, professionally sharpened, and a collection of iron chains, each ending in a collar. Greer reported his find to Sheriff Marston. Marston filed the report and did nothing. Why the inaction? Some historians suggest corruption, that the Dunleavys paid protection money to local officials. Others point to simple fear. The Ozarks in the late 19th century operated on an unspoken code. You minded your business, and your neighbors minded theirs. The government was distant, arbitrary, and often violent when it did intervene. Better to let sleeping dogs lie, even if those dogs had learned to sharpen axes. But the livestock disappearances changed the calculus. You could ignore rumors and oddities. You could not ignore 30 missing cattle and a dead rancher. The Dunleavys had crossed an invisible line, and the men of Newton County, veterans and farmers alike, decided it was time to remind the Hollow who held power in the region. They would march in, armed and numerous, and drag the clan into the light. Justice would be swift and public. It was a decision built on assumption that the Dunleavys were simply thieves, that isolation had made them weak, that 34 armed men could overpower any backwoods family. Every assumption was wrong. The militia's final mistake was believing they were the predators. Cyrus Webb knew the path was wrong before they'd gone a mile. The question wasn't whether they'd find the Dunleavys. It was whether they were being led exactly where the clan wanted them. The militia had assembled at first light on September 5, 1898, at the base of Iron Mountain. Sheriff Marston conducted a brief inspection. Every man carried a rifle, most had revolvers, a few had brought hunting knives. They packed hardtack, dried beef, and canteens for 3 days. Dr. Samuel Pendergast came along, his medical bag slung over one shoulder. He told his wife he'd be home by Sunday. Webb led them north along Crane Creek, then turned west into terrain that grew increasingly hostile. The morning air smelled of wet limestone and wild onion. Underfoot, the ground shifted from packed dirt to loose shale that clattered with each step. By 9 a.m., the forest had thickened enough to blot out direct sunlight, leaving only a greenish twilight that played tricks on depth perception. The men talked at first. Small jokes, speculation about what they'd find, reassurances that the Dunleavys would likely surrender without incident. But as the hours passed and the path narrowed, conversation died. The forest itself seemed to enforce silence, not through any supernatural force, but through the oppressive density of growth. Thorns caught at sleeves. Low branches required constant ducking. Sweat soaked through shirts despite the cool air. At 11:30 a.m., they stopped to rest near a spring. That's when Private Isaac Drummond noticed the markers. Drummond had served with the Missouri Infantry during the war, had learned to read terrain for ambush signs. He pointed them out to Marston. Small stacks of stones at irregular intervals, each stack precisely 3 stones high. They weren't natural formations. Someone had placed them deliberately, and recently, moss hadn't yet grown over the contact points. "Trail markers," Webb said quickly. "I set them last spring when I scouted the route." But Drummond counted 14 stacks visible from where they stood. Why would a trapper need so many markers on a path he claimed to know by heart? Marston ordered them forward. The forest was watching them now. By early afternoon, the character of the woods had changed. The hardwoods gave way to dense stands of cedar and pine. The ground rose and fell in sharp ridges that forced the group to walk single file. Visibility dropped to 20 yards. Every man felt it, the crawling sensation between shoulder blades that comes from being observed. Several times, Marston called for Webb to stop so they could listen. They heard nothing. Not birds, not insects, not even wind, just their own breathing and the crunch of boots on stone. At 3:15 p.m., they reached a clearing that Webb identified as the halfway point. The meadow was roughly circular, perhaps 200 feet across, surrounded by a wall of trees so uniform it looked planted. In the center sat the remains of a cabin, 4 walls of stacked stone, no roof, the interior choked with weeds. "Settlers tried to homestead here in '69, Webb explained. Didn't last a winter." When asked why, Webb didn't answer. The men ate quickly, speaking in whispers now without quite knowing why. Dr. Pendergast walked the perimeter of the ruin and found something that made him call Marston over. Carved into the stone above what had been the doorway was a symbol, a circle bisected by 3 vertical lines. The carving was deep, deliberate, and recent enough that the exposed stone still showed pale against weathering. "Dunleavy mark?" Marston asked Webb. "Never seen it before." They left the clearing at 4 p.m. and entered the deepest section of forest yet. Here the canopy closed completely. The temperature dropped. The path, if it could still be called that, became a suggestion more than a route, requiring Webb to stop frequently and study the terrain. Twice he backtracked, claiming he'd missed a turn. At 5:45 p.m., with less than an hour of usable light remaining, James Kohler spoke the thought everyone was harboring. "We're lost." Webb spun on him. "We're not lost. Blackwater Hollow is less than a mile ahead." Then why can't we hear the stream? Caller shot back. You said the hollow has a year-round creek. We should hear running water by now. The silence that followed confirmed it. No water sounds, no bird calls, no signs of the wildlife that should have been abundant at dusk. What would you do, press forward into darkness behind a guide you no longer trust, or admit defeat and attempt to retrace your steps through hostile terrain? Marston made the choice for them. They would camp for the night, post sentries in rotation, and complete the final approach at dawn when they could see clearly. It was the textbook decision, the safe decision. It was exactly what the Dunleavys needed them to do. The militia set up camp in a small depression between two ridges. No fires. Marston didn't want to announce their position. The men ate cold rations and wrapped themselves in blankets. 4 sentries were posted at cardinal points around the camp, each with a whistle to signal alarm. At 8:30 p.m., the first sentry reported hearing movement in the trees to the north. Marston investigated personally and found nothing. At 9:15, the eastern sentry whistled twice, the signal for possible contact. Again, nothing. By 10 p.m., every man was awake, gripping his rifle, staring into blackness so complete it felt solid. At 10:43 p.m., all 4 sentries whistled at once, and from every direction came the sound of axes striking wood in perfect rhythm, a circle of impacts that grew steadily closer, as if the forest itself was being dismantled around them. The Dunleavys had found them first. The axes stopped at midnight, and the screaming began at dawn. Between those hours lay a darkness so absolute that grown men wept and prayed in voices they didn't recognize as their own. The militia huddled in their depression as the rhythmic chopping circled them, never closer than 50 yards, never farther than 100. Every man had his rifle aimed outward, fingers white on triggers, but there was nothing to shoot at. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the ridges until direction became meaningless. Some men reported seeing movement between the trees, shadows that stood upright but moved wrong, too fluid, too purposeful. At 11:27 p.m., Private Drummond fired his rifle at a shape he swore was advancing on his position. The muzzle flash illuminated 30 feet of empty forest. Before the echo faded, the chopping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. Sheriff Marston whispered orders. Maintain positions, conserve ammunition, wait for daylight. Dr. Pendergast moved among the men, checking for injuries born of panic. One militiaman had bitten through his lower lip. Another had gripped his rifle so tightly he'd fractured 2 fingers without realizing it. At 1:38 a.m., Webb tried to run. He made it 20 yards before the militia heard him crash through undergrowth. Then a sound like a sack of grain hitting stone, then nothing. Marston sent 3 men after him with a shielded lantern. They found his rifle and 1 boot. The boot still had a foot in it, severed cleanly above the ankle. They did not find the rest of Cyrus Webb. The Dunleavys were teaching them the rules. Dawn arrived with agonizing slowness, the blackness thinning to gray 1 degree at a time. As visibility returned, the militia discovered they were no longer in the depression where they'd made camp. Sometime during the night, though not a single man remembered moving, they had been herded or had wandered into a box canyon. Sheer limestone walls rose 40 feet on 3 sides. The only exit was a narrow gap barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. In the growing light, they saw what decorated the canyon walls: the missing livestock, cattle and hogs, butchered and displayed, their hides nailed to the rock face in overlapping rows like shingles. Some were fresh enough to still drip. Others had been there for weeks, dried to leather by wind and sun. The smell was overwhelming. Copper and rot and something else. Something wrong, like spoiled flowers, and carved into every visible surface. That same symbol. A circle bisected by 3 vertical lines. 27 men remained. 7 had vanished during the night without a sound. Marston assembled them in the center of the canyon and delivered orders in a voice barely above a whisper. They would proceed through the gap in military formation, rifles ready, moving as one unit toward the creek they could now hear, faintly, beyond the northern ridge. Once they reached water, they would follow it downstream toward civilization. No stopping, no breaking formation. Anyone who fell behind would be left behind. The vote was unanimous. They entered the gap at 6:52 a.m., Marston leading, Drummond at the rear. The passage was so narrow their shoulders scraped stone on both sides. Above them, the walls leaned inward, reducing the sky to a ribbon of pale blue. Their boots splashed through a trickle of water that ran down the center, runoff from the night's dew or something else. It smelled like iron. The gap extended for 80 yards. Halfway through, the man in the middle of the column, a farmer named Robert Finch, stopped moving. The men behind him collided into his back. When they asked what was wrong, Finch pointed upward with a shaking hand. Lining both walls of the gap, standing on ledges barely wide enough to support their weight, were the Dunleavys. 11 adults, 19 children. All of them silent, motionless, staring down at the trapped militia with expressions that held no anger, no fear, no recognizable human emotion. They wore homespun clothing stained dark with use. Their hands hung at their sides. They made no threatening moves. They simply watched. What kind of people arranged themselves like an audience for slaughter? Marston screamed the order to run. The formation collapsed into a stampede as 30 men tried to force themselves through a space meant for 2. Rifles clattered against stone. Someone fired a shot that ricocheted 3 times before finding flesh, one of their own. The wounded man went down and was trampled without ceremony. The Dunleavys still didn't move. The militia burst from the gap into a second clearing, this one sloping downward toward the sound of water. They ran without formation now, each man following his own panic. Dr. Pendergast tripped over exposed roots and fell hard enough to crack 3 ribs. 2 men stopped to help him. The rest kept running. Those 2 men bought the others 90 seconds. The attack came not from behind, but from the flanks. The Dunleavys had circled through paths only they knew, paths the militia had walked past without seeing. They struck with tools, not guns. Axes and mattocks and skinning knives wielded with the efficiency of men performing familiar labor. The militiamen who turned to fight discovered their rifles were useless at arm's length. You cannot reload while someone is driving a wedge into your sternum. The killing was surgical, systematic, silent. 16 men reached the creek. 14 made it across, slipping on moss-covered stones, splashing through water that rose to their waists. They scrambled up the far bank and into forest that seemed to offer cover. Behind them, the sounds of the final 9 being dispatched echoed off the hollow walls, chopping sounds mostly, and the wet crack of breaking bone. Then again, silence. The 14 survivors ran south, abandoning their wounded, their supplies, their dead. They ran through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate at speed, but which somehow opened before them like a corridor. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs failed, and they collapsed against trees to vomit and weep. And when they finally looked back, They saw the Dunleavy children standing in a perfect line along the creek bank they'd just crossed, still silent, still watching. Not pursuing, not attacking, just watching them run. Because the Dunleavys weren't hunting them anymore. They were herding them towards something worse. The clearing opened before them like a mouth. 14 exhausted men stumbled into it at 8:37 a.m., believing they'd found sanctuary. They had found the heart of the nightmare instead. The Dunleavy compound sat in a depression so perfectly circular, it couldn't be natural. The main lodge dominated the center, a structure built from whole logs chinked with red clay, 2 stories tall with a roof of layered bark. Around it clustered 7 smaller buildings, storage sheds, a smokehouse, what might have been a chapel with a crude wooden cross mounted above the door. And circling everything, driven into the earth at precise intervals, were the stakes the trappers had reported. Sharpened logs 10 feet high, each one carved with that recurring symbol. But it was what hung from the stakes that stopped the militia cold. Clothing. Dozens of articles of clothing, arranged by type and size, fluttering in the morning breeze like prayer flags. Shirts and dresses, trousers and skirts, children's garments no larger than a man's hand. Some items were so old they'd bleached white in the sun. Others still held their color. A woman's blue shawl, a man's red suspenders, a child's yellow bonnet. No bodies, just the clothes. Sheriff Marston raised his hand for silence and studied the compound. No smoke rose from the chimney. No movement showed in the windows, if there were windows. The walls revealed only dark openings that might have been doors, or might have been something else. The entire settlement had the stillness of a photograph, a moment frozen and preserved. "They're not here," whispered James Caller. "They led us away from their home." It was the hope they all wanted to believe, that the Dunleavys were still behind them at the creek, that this place was abandoned, that they could rest here and tend their wounds before attempting the journey home. 3 men had injuries serious enough to slow them. Dr. Pendergast, still functional despite his broken ribs, needed somewhere stable to work. Marston made the decision. They would search the buildings quickly, take any supplies they found, and leave within the hour. The buildings were not empty. The first structure they entered was the smokehouse, identifiable by its lack of windows and the smell that leaked from its walls. Private Drummond kicked open the door and immediately staggered backward, retching. Inside, hanging from iron hooks driven into the ceiling beams, were cuts of meat in various stages of curing. The shapes were wrong, too long in some places, jointed in ways that beef or pork never were. No one voiced what they all understood. They closed the door and moved on. The storage sheds yielded tools organized with obsessive precision. One building held only axes, perhaps 50 of them, arranged by size from hatchet to splitting maul. Another held rope coiled in perfect spirals, each coil exactly the same circumference. A third held nothing but clay, pots, hundreds of them, stacked floor to ceiling. When one man lifted a pot to check its contents, he found it filled with teeth, human teeth, sorted by type, molars separated from incisors separated from canines. He set the pot down carefully and backed away. The chapel was worse for what it lacked than what it contained. Pews made from split logs faced a rough altar on which sat a single object. A leather-bound book so old its pages had fused into a solid mass. No crosses decorated the walls, no biblical verses. Just that symbol, carved into every surface, repeated until the walls seemed to writhe with it. And in the dirt floor before the altar, someone had drawn a map. Marston knelt to examine it. The map showed the Ozark region with remarkable accuracy. Ridges, valleys, water sources, all precisely rendered. But it also showed structures that didn't exist on any official map. Buildings scattered throughout the hills, each marked with a small X. Marston counted 47 X marks. "How many families are there?" someone asked. The question hung unanswered. They saved the main lodge for last. Approaching it required crossing open ground with no cover, and every man felt the weight of unseen eyes. The front door stood ajar. Drummond entered first, rifle raised, and stopped so suddenly the men behind him collided with his back. The interior was a single vast room that occupied the entire first floor. A fire pit sat in the center, cold now but showing signs of recent use. Around it, positioned in a perfect circle, were 11 chairs carved from whole tree trunks, each one sized for an adult. And beyond the chairs, covering every inch of wall space from floor to ceiling, were names. Thousands of names, carved into the wood with painstaking care. Names and dates going back decades. Some were clearly family names. Dunleavy appeared again and again. But others were unfamiliar, foreign-sounding, impossible to pronounce. And accompanying many of the names were small notations. Delivered, accepted, consumed, joined. Dr. Pendergast found his own name. It was carved near the door, fresh enough that wood shavings still littered the floor beneath it. Next to his name, carved in smaller script, September 5th, 1898. The date they'd entered the forest. And beside that, not yet filled in, a blank space waiting for additional notation. Every man in the militia searched the walls. Every man found his name. They were the inventory. The realization hit them simultaneously. This wasn't an ambush or a territorial dispute or even simple murder. The Dunleavys had been expecting them, had prepared for them, had carved their names into the walls before they'd even left Cassville, as if their arrival and their fates were as certain as the sunrise. Kohler was the first to break. He screamed something incoherent and ran for the door. 3 men followed him. The rest stood frozen, staring at their names, reading the dates that accompanied other names. Dates stretching back to 1853, to the year Ezekiel Dunleavy had first arrived in Missouri. 70 years of names, 70 years of people who'd entered these hills and never emerged. Above them, from the second floor, came the sound of someone walking. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing from one side of the building to the other. Then back again. Then silence. Marston pointed to the stairs, a ladder, really, leading to a hole in the ceiling. 2 men would go up. 2 would stay below to cover their retreat. Drummond volunteered to climb. So did a young farmer named Thomas Elkins, who'd barely spoken since the attack at the creek. They ascended the ladder with revolvers drawn. The second floor was a dormitory lined with straw mattresses, each one occupied. 23 people lay motionless on those mattresses, arranged with their heads toward the center of the room, feet toward the walls. Men, women, children. Their eyes were open. Their chests rose and fell with shallow breaths. But they showed no awareness of the intruders. No reaction to voices or touch. Drummond recognized 2 of them, militiamen who'd vanished during the night. They were alive. Their wounds had been carefully bandaged. They'd been stripped of their clothing and redressed in homespun garments identical to what the Dunleavys wore. And carved into their forearms, still seeping blood, was that symbol. What did they do to them? Elkins whispered. Before Drummond could answer, one of the dormitory occupants sat up. It was a woman, perhaps 30 years old, hollow-cheeked and hollow-eyed. She turned her head toward the intruders with mechanical precision and spoke in a voice that carried no inflection, no emotion, no humanity. The forest provides. The hollow accepts. The family continues. Then she lay back down and resumed her shallow breathing. Drummond and Elkins descended the ladder faster than they'd climbed it. The militia fled the compound at 9:21 a.m., leaving behind their wounded, their supplies, and any pretense of military order. They ran south through forest that no longer seemed to resist their passage, that seemed instead to guide them along paths they hadn't noticed before. Behind them, the Dunleavy compound sat silent and empty once more, waiting for the next names to be fulfilled. But running was no longer an escape. It was simply the next phase of a ritual that had been perfected over 70 years, and the worst revelation was still waiting in the trees ahead. 10 men reached the river at 2:47 p.m., and they should have recognized it as a gift too generous to be real. After hours of blind flight through forest that seemed to anticipate their every turn, they burst through a wall of willows onto the bank of Crane Creek, the same waterway they'd followed into the hills 3 days prior. The current ran swift and clear, flowing southeast toward civilization. They could follow it home. Safety lay downstream, perhaps 8 miles, maybe less. Sheriff Marston collapsed to his knees in the shallows and drank until he vomited. The others did the same, too thirsty to care about dignity. Dr. Pendergast examined the group with a physician's eye and delivered his assessment in a voice stripped of professional detachment. 2 men had infections starting in minor wounds. 1 had a fever climbing toward delirium, and all of them were approaching the edge of what the human body could endure without rest. They needed to stop. They needed to build a fire, boil water, eat something beyond panic and adrenaline. But stopping meant being caught. Private Drummond settled the debate by pointing upstream. 300 yards distant, standing on an outcropping of limestone that jutted into the creek, were the Dunleavy children. All 19 of them, arranged in 3 rows like a choir waiting for a conductor's signal. They weren't moving, weren't speaking, just watching the militia with that same blank patience they'd displayed at every previous encounter. "Why aren't they attacking?" someone asked. Marston understood before anyone else. "Because they don't need to. They're just making sure we go the right direction." The militia moved downstream, staying to the creek bed where the water would hide their tracks. The current tugged at their boots. Smooth river stones turned ankles and bloodied knees. Every 50 yards, 1 man would glance backward to confirm the children were still following. They always were, maintaining that precise 300-yard distance, never closing the gap, never falling behind. They were being delivered. At 4:18 p.m., the creek widened into a pool where the water deepened to chest height. The far bank rose steep and tangled with roots. Difficult terrain, but navigable. Marston ordered the crossing. The men waded in, rifles held overhead to keep powder dry. The water was shockingly cold, fed by springs that never saw sunlight. Halfway across, Thomas Elkins stepped into a hole and went under. He surfaced sputtering, thrashing for purchase, and found it. Something solid beneath the water that he gripped for balance. Then he screamed and let go, splashing backward toward the bank they'd just left. The others reached him and dragged him onto dry ground. "What did you touch?" Drummond demanded. Elkins couldn't speak. He could only point at the pool with a shaking hand. 2 men waded back to investigate, poking with sticks until they contacted the submerged object. Together they hauled it to the surface, a cage woven from green willow branches, weighted with stones, designed to sink and stay submerged. Inside the cage was what remained of Cyrus Webb. The trapper had been alive when they put him in. The willow bars showed marks where he'd gripped them, trying to pull them apart. His fingernails were torn away. His mouth was open in a scream that had filled with creek water and drowned unheard. And carved into his forehead, deep enough to show white bone, was that symbol. They left him in the shallows and completed the crossing in silence. The far bank offered no comfort. The forest pressed close, and the light was already starting to fail. In 90 minutes, maybe less, full darkness would settle over the Ozarks. The idea of spending another night in these hills broke something essential in several men. One began to laugh, high and shrill. Another sat down and refused to stand despite threats and pleading. What would you do when your body is spent, your mind is fracturing, and the enemy hasn't even revealed itself fully? Marston made the call. They would prepare for a final stand here, at the creek crossing, where they had water at their backs and an open killing field to their front. They would build fortifications from deadfall, position themselves in overlapping fields of fire, and fight until dawn or death, whichever came first. For the next hour, the militia worked with the desperate efficiency of men who know they're digging their own graves. They dragged logs into a rough semicircle, piled stones for additional cover, cleared the underbrush to eliminate ambush positions. Dr. Pendergast distributed the remaining ammunition, 11 rounds per man. Marston positioned his fighters carefully, the best shots at the flanks, the wounded in the center where they could provide supporting fire without needing to maneuver. At 5:53 p.m., with perhaps 20 minutes of good light remaining, the Dunleavy children emerged from the forest. They walked to the edge of the clearing and stopped, forming a line that stretched 40 yards from end to end. Behind them came the adults, all 11, moving with the unhurried confidence of people completing a familiar task. They carried their tools openly. Axes rested on shoulders. Knives hung from belts. One man held a mattock still crusted with dried blood and bits of tissue. And behind the adults came the others. The hollow-eyed people from the dormitory, 23 of them, shuffling forward in loose formation. Among them walked the 2 militiamen who'd vanished during the first night. They wore Dunleavy clothing now. Their forearms bore fresh scars. They stared at their former comrades with no recognition, no plea for help, no indication they remembered being human. Ezekiel Dunleavy, or perhaps his great-grandson, the resemblance was absolute, stepped forward from the line. He was a tall man, gaunt, with a beard that reached his chest. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the clearing, despite being barely above a whisper. The forest provides. The hollow accepts. The family continues. Then he raised one hand, and the line advanced. Marston gave the order to fire. The rifles cracked in ragged sequence. 3 Dunleavys fell. 2 of the hollow-eyed people dropped. The rest kept walking, not running, not charging, just walking with that same mechanical purposefulness. The militia reloaded and fired again. More bodies hit the ground. Still they came. At 20 yards, the Dunleavys finally broke into a run. The fighting that followed lasted less than 3 minutes, but would be recounted in whispers for decades by the 6 men who survived it. There was no strategy, no tactics, just the animal struggle of creatures fighting for one more breath. Rifle butts shattered skulls. Knives found soft tissue. Men grappled in the dirt, biting and clawing when weapons were lost. Private Drummond killed 2 Dunleavys with his revolver before an axe blade split his collarbone and left arm dangling by strips of meat. Dr. Pendergast drove his scalpel into an attacker's throat and was immediately dragged down by 3 of the hollow-eyed people who bore him to the ground and began methodically dismantling him while he was still conscious enough to scream. Sheriff Marston fought until his ammunition was gone, then drew his knife and held the center of the line until a mattock blow crushed his knee. He fell, still slashing at anything within reach, and was eventually buried under a pile of bodies, Dunleavy and militia alike, all of them moving less and less until they stopped entirely. The sun touched the horizon at 6:32 p.m. By 6:45, the clearing was silent again. 6 militiamen fled into the darkness, following the creek by sound alone, crashing through water and over stones with no thought beyond distance. Behind them, the Dunleavys did not pursue. They had what they needed: 28 bodies, 24 names to be carved into walls, new stock for the dormitory once the wounds healed, and the conversion took hold. The survivors ran until dawn, and when they finally collapsed on the outskirts of Cassville at 7:18 a.m. on September 8th, they couldn't speak for 2 days. When they finally could, no one believed them. The 6 survivors told their story once, and the government made certain they never told it again. What happens when the truth is so monstrous that burying it becomes an act of civic duty? And what grows in the soil where that truth was planted? The men who stumbled into Cassville on the morning of September 8, 1898, were barely recognizable as the farmers and Civil War veterans who'd left 3 days prior. Thomas Elkins had aged 20 years, his hair gone white at the temples. James Collar couldn't stop his hands from shaking. The others bore visible injuries: Drummond's ruined arm, festering wounds that wept clear fluid, feet so damaged by flight that several men would never walk properly again. Sheriff Marston was not among them. Neither was Dr. Pendergast or 26 other men whose wives and children waited in the Methodist church where the recruitment meeting had been held. When the survivors were finally able to speak coherently, after food, water, and a night's sleep under guard because 2 of them kept trying to run back into the hills, they told a story so grotesque that the town council convened an emergency session within hours. The meeting was closed to the public. No minutes were recorded. But a clerk named William Thatcher, who stood outside the door, later wrote in his personal diary what he overheard. They spoke of a family that farms men like cattle, of a compound that has been taking people for 70 years, of names carved in walls like harvest tallies. One survivor kept repeating, "They're still alive. The missing are still alive," until Councilman Morris told him to shut his mouth, or they'd shut it for him. The council's decision was unanimous and swift. The official story would be that the militia encountered a flash flood in Blackwater Hollow on September 6th. The terrain was treacherous. The weather had been unpredictable. 28 men drowned or were swept away, their bodies lost in the current. The 6 survivors escaped by sheer luck. It was a tragedy, but a natural one. No further action would be taken. When Elkins protested, when he stood up and demanded they send a proper military force to rescue the men being held in the dormitory, Councilman Morris leaned across the table and delivered a response that Elkins would repeat, verbatim, in letters he wrote decades later. "Son, you think we don't know what's in those hills? You think you're the first to go looking? We've been feeding that hollow for 3 generations because it's easier than what happens when we don't. You go home. You forget what you saw. You tell your children the flood story. Or we'll find a way to make you forget permanent-like." The cover-up was not incompetence. It was policy. Within a week, every family member of the missing men received a visit from county officials. They were given death certificates citing accidental drowning. They were given modest compensation, $50 per victim, paid from a discretionary fund that appeared in no public budget. They were strongly advised that any alternative theories about their loved one's disappearance would be considered slander against the county government and would be prosecuted accordingly. Most accepted the terms. 2 families did not. Margaret Harmon, widow of Elias Harmon, the militiaman whose belt buckle had been found in the forest, hired a private investigator from Kansas City. The investigator, a former Pinkerton named Charles Dane, departed for the Ozarks on October 3rd with detailed maps and a team of 3 assistants. He sent his last telegram from Cassville on October 7th. Following new leads, will report findings in 3 days. Charles Dane was never heard from again. Neither were his assistants. The other dissenting family was that of Dr. Samuel Pendergast. His wife, Catherine, refused the compensation money and instead wrote letters, dozens of them, to newspapers in Springfield, St. Louis, and Kansas City, detailing her suspicions that her husband had not died in a flood but had been murdered by outlaws the government refused to pursue. Her letters were published in 2 papers before both received visits from federal marshals carrying sealed orders. Catherine Pendergast's letters stopped appearing in November. She died in January of 1899 from what the coroner listed as accidental ingestion of rat poison. She was 41 years old and in perfect health prior to her death. Her funeral was attended by 6 people, none of them family members. The survivors scattered. Drummond moved to Illinois, where he worked as a night watchman and never married. Kohler went west to Colorado and was committed to an asylum in 1902 after attacking a stranger he claimed was wearing the wrong face. Elkins lasted the longest. He stayed in Missouri, worked his farm, raised a family, and kept silent for 37 years. Then, in 1935, at age 63, with his children grown and his wife deceased, he wrote everything down. The manuscript was 17 pages, handwritten in careful script, titled The Truth About Blackwater Hollow. He mailed copies to the Springfield newspaper, the Missouri Historical Society, and the U.S. Department of Justice. All 3 copies were intercepted before delivery. Federal agents visited Elkins's farm on June 19, 1935. Witnesses reported seeing a black sedan arrive at dusk and depart 2 hours later. Thomas Elkins hanged himself that night in his barn. The coroner ruled it suicide. His manuscript was never found, but fragments survived. Letters to his children, diary entries, second-hand accounts from people he'd spoken to in his final years. And those fragments tell a story more disturbing than the massacre itself. Elkins claimed the Dunleavys were not unique. He wrote of discovering, through careful research at county archives, that similar disappearances had been reported throughout the Ozarks for over a century. Clusters of missing persons, always in remote hollows, always attributed to natural causes or simple migration. And he found patterns. Families who appeared in census records with no prior history, who accumulated no property records, who paid no taxes but were never prosecuted. They are everywhere, he wrote in his final diary entry. Not just Blackwater. Every range of hills holds a hollow that holds a family, and the families hold something older, something that was here before we named it Missouri, before we named it America. We did not discover these mountains. We negotiated with what already occupied them, and the price of negotiation is silence. The silence held for decades. No official expedition to Blackwater Hollow was ever mounted. Maps continued to show the area as uninhabited wilderness. Hunters and trappers learned to avoid certain valleys. Families whispered warnings to their children about staying on marked trails. And every few years, Someone would disappear in the hills. A hiker, a hunter, a surveyor, and the explanation was always the same. The Ozarks are dangerous. The terrain is unforgiving. People get lost. In 1962, a team of geologists surveying for mineral deposits reported finding structural anomalies in the region near what their maps called Hollow Creek Valley, the modern name for the area that had once been Blackwater Hollow. They described circular depressions consistent with sinkhole formations and scattered stone foundations that might have been homesteads abandoned during the Depression. They also reported finding, in one of those depressions, a vertical shaft extending at least 200 feet into the limestone. They dropped a weighted line and never found bottom. They reported hearing sounds from the shaft. Wind, they assumed, though the tone was described as almost vocal, almost words. The geological survey was terminated early due to equipment failure and atmospheric anomalies. The team's detailed notes were classified and remain so to this day. No one has officially entered Blackwater Hollow since, but locals know better than to trust official designations. They know the families are still there, in their hollows, following their cycles. They know the missing don't always stay missing. Sometimes they come back changed, speaking in flat voices, carving symbols on trees. They know that some doors should never be knocked on, some trails should never be followed, and some questions should never be asked out loud where the mountains can hear. The massacre of 34 men in 1898 wasn't the beginning of the horror. It was just the moment when the horror briefly became visible before the darkness closed over it again. And in the deep hollows, where the trees grow too thick and the ridges block the sun, the families continue their work. The forest provides. The hollow accepts. The family continues, even now. Hikers in the Ozarks sometimes report finding clothes hanging from tree branches miles from any trail. Fresh clothes, recently worn, still holding the shape of bodies that aren't there anymore. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.